Hi, so I want to talk to you about some more of the DBT skills, and this time looking at one of the skills from the distress tolerance module. So this module is about tolerating your distress and getting through a situation without doing something that makes the situation worse. This module is not about problem solving, it's not about making everything better in a situation, but it's about being able to get through those really difficult or unpleasant situations in a manner that is helpful to you and to other people as well. So the skill I want to talk to you about is pros and cons. And this is thinking about the pros and the cons of either tolerating the distress, so using skillful behaviour to get through a situation, or not tolerating the distress and maybe relying on some of those strategies that have been unhelpful for you in the past. So that might be things such as self-harm, it might be gambling, it might be alcohol or drug use. And so what we would think about with this is we would want you to maybe come up with a column for the pros and a column for the cons and really have a think about those for whatever decision you are making in that moment. Is it best for me to use a skillful behaviour to tolerate this distress? Or am I going to do something that I've relied on in the past but actually I know creates more problems for me? And so when we're thinking about doing pros and cons, either you can do it in your head, so it can be a quick run through of what are the pros of this decision and what are the cons, or what can be quite helpful sometimes is to write it out on paper, because once it's written out on paper, we can't then dismiss one of the things that we've come up with. But what you need to think about when you're doing pros and cons is not only look about the short term, we need to look about the long term pros and the long term cons as well. Because sometimes as human beings, what we want is instant gratification, but that can create more problems for us. So when you're doing your pros and cons, trying to think about what are the short term and what are the long term aspects of this decision making. What you also need to think about is when you're doing your pros and cons, the different weight of each of the pros and cons. So it could be that you have loads and loads of pros of doing something and you only have one or two cons maybe. But actually when you look a bit harder at these, it might be that the cons really carry quite a lot of weight with them. And therefore, even though there are more pros, it is more weighted on one side. So we need to consider the long and the short term and the weight of the things that we're putting on our pros and cons column. Now, it can be quite difficult to do pros and cons when we are in emotion mind. I know I've had before that I've done a pros and cons, maybe of, I don't know, eating cake. But if I'm in emotion mind and I really want that cake, sometimes I'm able to make the pros and cons come out to how I want it to. So we need to think about when we're doing pros and cons, maybe beforehand doing one of our distress tolerance skills to reduce our emotions slightly, and then doing pros and cons from more of a wise mind perspective. What we could also do is think about asking somebody for help doing the pros and cons. Or what we could do is think about stepping outside of that and thinking about if I was doing the pros and cons for somebody else, what would I put on there? And that just allows us to create some distance from our emotional reasoning that's going on there. So pros and cons is about, just as it says on the tin, thinking about the positives and the negative aspects of either tolerating the distress, so using a skillful behaviour, which you'll learn about in the other videos, or not tolerating the distress and maybe doing something that makes the situation worse for yourself and maybe for other people as well.